Have you ever experienced a moment so quiet, so unexpected, that it felt as though time itself had paused around you? Maybe you were sitting alone at your kitchen table, resting in a hospital room, or staring through a window without really looking at anything at all. Then suddenly, a bird landed nearby and looked directly at you. Not for a second, not in passing, but long enough to make something inside your heart become strangely still. If something like that has ever happened to you, stay with me for a moment. Because throughout history, faithful people have shared stories of small living creatures appearing during some of the most difficult moments of their lives. These encounters often happened during grief, illness, prayer, loneliness, or seasons when hope felt impossible to find. Over the years, I have sat beside people facing death. I have listened to those carrying unbearable sorrow. I have spoken with men and women who had completely lost hope and believed nothing good remained ahead of them. Yet in so many of those moments, something unexpected appeared. Sometimes it was a moth pressing gently against a window. Sometimes it was a deer standing motionless near the edge of a yard. Other times it was a robin that refused to leave a porch railing for days. At first, I dismissed such stories as coincidence. But the more I listened, the harder it became to ignore them. Perhaps heaven is much closer than we realize. Perhaps we miss its reminders because we expect something dramatic, something impossible to overlook. We imagine thunder, blazing light, or grand miracles. Yet often, what arrives is quiet and small. It comes without announcement. It arrives gently. Sometimes it has wings. Sometimes it walks on four legs. Sometimes it simply appears and waits for us to notice. Let me ask you something honestly. Has there ever been an encounter with an animal that stayed in your memory for years, but you never told anyone because you worried they would think you were foolish? Maybe a bird kept returning after someone you loved passed away. Maybe a butterfly landed on your hand and remained there far longer than seemed natural. If your answer is yes, you are not alone. By the time we finish this journey together, I hope you understand why that moment stayed with you and why it may have carried more meaning than you ever allowed yourself to believe. Many years ago, I knew a woman whose story has never left me. I will not tell you her name because, in many ways, her experience could belong to almost anyone. She had lost her husband 6 months earlier and was learning what life felt like after a great love disappeared. The hardest part, she told me, was not the grief itself. It was the silence. A house that once echoed with footsteps had become painfully quiet. There were no familiar voices calling from another room, no coffee cups left in the sink, no daily interruptions that once seemed ordinary, but now felt priceless. Every day felt emptier than the one before. One morning, she stepped outside with a cup of tea and sat on the back steps of her home. She was not trying to enjoy the morning. She simply needed something to hold while she sat alone with her thoughts. As she looked across the yard, a small brown bird landed only a few feet away. What caught her attention was not that it appeared. It was that it stayed. The bird tilted its head and looked toward her as though it were listening. Minutes passed, yet it showed no desire to fly away. Eventually overwhelmed by emotion, she spoke aloud into the empty air. She said, "I don't know if you're real or if I'm losing my mind, but if my husband sent you, do something. Anything." Bird hopped closer. Then it moved closer again. Wild birds do not usually behave that way around people. Yet there it remained, sitting quietly beside her, while months of buried grief finally broke free. She cried harder than she had cried since the day her husband died. For nearly 20 minutes, the little bird stayed near her. Later, she told me something I have never forgotten. "I don't know if it was an angel," she said, "but after that day, I didn't feel alone anymore. That is what I want to talk about today. Not superstition, not fortune-telling, not attempts to control things that belong only to God. We are not discussing practices that claim power over the unseen world. In fact, later we will talk about why those paths can be dangerous. Instead, we are exploring something far older and far simpler, across generations. Many faithful people have believed that during moments of deep need, when the distance between earthly pain and heavenly comfort feels especially thin, certain creatures sometimes appear as gentle reminders of God's presence, not gods, not spirits to be summoned, not objects of worship, simply signs. Small reminders sent by a loving Father who understands that sometimes we need something visible to reassure us that we have not been forgotten. This idea is not foreign to Scripture. One of the most powerful moments recorded in the Bible includes a dove descending from heaven. It arrived gently yet unmistakably. Aaron, marking a sacred moment when heaven touched earth in a way that all could recognize. Long before that, another dove flew across endless floodwaters, searching for evidence that destruction had finally ended. And when it returned carrying an olive leaf, it brought a message of hope that believers have remembered ever since. Then there were the ravens. Unlike the graceful symbols people often imagine, ravens were ordinary, dark birds. Yet God used them to feed a prophet hiding in the wilderness when human help had vanished. Morning and evening, they brought what he needed to survive. Think about that for a moment. God could have chosen countless ways to provide for his servant. Yet he chose birds, piet creatures, overlooked creatures, sibyl creatures. That tells us something important about how God often works. Not through constant spectacle, not always through dramatic displays, but frequently through humble things that people overlook. And for centuries, Christian tradition has preserved stories about certain creatures appearing during seasons of sorrow, prayer, and spiritual need. These stories have been passed from grandparents to grandchildren and shared among believers seeking comfort during life's hardest moments. Among all of them, one creature appears more often than any other. Bird. Of all the signs people speak about, the bird remains the oldest and most consistent symbol associated with heavenly reminders. There is a simple reason for that. Birds belong to both worlds in a way few creatures do. They live upon the earth, yet spend much of their lives moving through the sky above it. Since ancient times, many believers have viewed them as natural symbols connecting what is seen with what is unseen. When a small bird appears during a season of grief, sits outside a hospital window, or sings outside a funeral on the exact morning someone needs comfort most, countless faithful people have interpreted it as a gentle whisper, not proof, not doctrine. Not something to build an entire belief system around, just a whisper saying, "You are seen, you are heard." Heaven has not forgotten this moment, and there is something else worth noticing. In these stories, it is rarely the large birds that appear. It is not usually the eagle, the hawk, or the crow. More often, it is the sparrow, the robin, or another small bird that most people would normally overlook. And perhaps that is significant. After all, when Jesus wanted to teach people how carefully God watches over them, he did not point to mighty eagles soaring overhead. He pointed to sparrows, small birds that seemed ordinary and unimportant to the world. Yet he reminded his followers that not one sparrow falls without the Father's knowledge. That truth still matters today. Because maybe the reason these small birds touch people so deeply is that they quietly remind us of the same message. You are known, you are seen, and even in your darkest hour, you have not been forgotten. Part 2. There is another kind of bird-related encounter that people describe again and again, and it carries a slightly different feeling. It is the appearance of something white, a white dove, a white feather, or even a feather discovered in an unusually meaningful place when no bird seems to be anywhere nearby. I have heard stories like these from people who would never describe themselves as especially religious. Someone finds a perfectly white feather on a windowsill. Another notices one lying directly in their path during a moment of intense grief. To them, the timing feels strangely personal, as though something ordinary has suddenly become impossible to ignore. But we need to be careful here. Not every feather is a message from heaven. Sometimes a feather is simply a feather, and pretending that every ordinary event has a supernatural explanation can lead us away from reality rather than closer to God. What matters in these stories is often the combination of timing and personal experience. A person is already carrying something heavy, and then a small event occurs that brings an unexpected sense of peace or stillness. For many faithful people, that moment becomes a quiet reminder of God's care rather than proof of something supernatural. And that distinction matters upon us. The purpose is not to convince yourself that every unusual thing has a hidden meaning. And it is to recognize that sometimes an ordinary part of creation can become meaningful because of what is happening inside your heart at that exact moment. That brings us to the second creature, the deer. At first, the deer may seem like an unusual choice. Unlike birds, deer are not naturally associated with the sky or with heavenly messengers. They belong to forests, fields, and quiet edges of the wilderness. But there is something about the deer that has carried deep meaning within the language of faith for generations. The deer represents longing. Scripture uses the image of a deer desperately seeking water to describe the soul's hunger for God. It is not a casual desire. It is the kind of thirst that becomes impossible to ignore, the kind of need that reaches down into the deepest part of a person. A thirsty deer does not search for water because it wants something pleasant. It searches because it needs water to live. That image gives the deer a powerful place within Christian reflection. It becomes a picture of the human soul reaching for God with that same intensity. So when people encounter a deer during a deeply emotional moment, they sometimes see more than an animal crossing their path. Imagine someone standing at the edge of their yard during a difficult season. They look up and find a deer standing completely still nearby. It does not immediately run. It does not disappear into the trees. Instead, it simply looks toward them. For many people, that moment becomes unforgettable. And there is a reason. The deer are naturally alert creatures. A sudden sound or movement can cause them to disappear almost instantly into the woods. So when one remains unusually still in the presence of a person, the experience can feel extraordinary. Within the stories of faithful people, that stillness has often been interpreted as a gentle invitation. Be still. Stop running. Stop trying to solve everything at once. Rest for a moment. And perhaps the message is not that the problem has disappeared. Perhaps it is simply that you do not have to carry every part of it alone. I remember an older man who once described such an encounter to me. It happened the night before his wife was scheduled for surgery, and fear had made sleep almost impossible. At around 3 a.m, he went outside and sat on the porch. Here, he described the fear inside him as though something heavy had been placed directly on his chest. Then a deer emerged from the tree line. It moved toward the area near his porch steps and stopped. It did not seem interested in eating. It did not immediately move away. It simply remained there, looking toward the house. He estimated that it stood there for nearly 10 minutes, although he admitted afterward that it may have been only a couple of minutes. What mattered was what happened inside him. His fear did not disappear. His wife's surgery was still scheduled for the following morning. The situation remained frightening, and the outcome was still completely outside his control. But something became quieter inside him. Ori. He later described the experience with a simple sentence. Something told me I wasn't carrying it alone. That is an important way to understand these encounters. They are not necessarily about removing the burden. They are about remembering that you were never meant to carry the burden entirely by yourself. And that leads us to the third creature, the butterfly. Of all the creatures we are discussing, the butterfly may carry one of the gentlest and most recognizable images of transformation. Today, butterflies are often discussed through modern ideas about energy, spirit animals, and other spiritual systems. But that is not what we are talking about here. The Christian understanding of the butterfly comes from something much simpler: transformation. Consider what a butterfly begins as. It starts as a small creature moving along a leaf, bound to the ground in a form that seems completely unrelated to what it will eventually become. And then comes a period of stillness and hidden change. From the outside, it can appear as though nothing is happening. But something profound is taking place. When the transformation is complete, the creature that emerges is completely different from what came before. It has wings. It can rise into the air. It can move through the world in a way its earlier form could never have imagined. For Christians, that image naturally brings to mind death and resurrection. The old form appears to end, but the story does not end there. This is why butterflies have appeared in Christian artwork and symbolism throughout history. They have sometimes been placed alongside images connected with resurrection and eternal life because they provide a visible picture of transformation. What appears to be an ending may not be the final chapter. What is buried may rise transformed. And what looks like loss from one perspective may, within the hope of Christian faith, point toward a reality we cannot yet see. That is why butterfly encounters can become especially meaningful during grief. A butterfly appearing at a funeral can remain in someone's memory for years. The same can happen when one appears near a grave, inside a hospital room, or around the anniversary of a loved one's death. Again, this does not mean every butterfly has been sent from heaven. The point is not to turn nature into a system of secret codes. The point is that something already present in God's creation can become a powerful reminder of something believers already hold at the center of their faith: resurrection, hope, transformation. I once knew a young mother who lost her baby far too early. There were no perfect words for a loss like that, and there was no explanation that could make such grief disappear. Then, on the day they buried her child, something happened that remained with her. It was a cold morning, and there were no flowers blooming around them for miles. During the service, a single butterfly appeared. It circled the small white casket 3 times. Then it landed directly on top of it and remained there through the service. For that mother, the moment became deeply significant. She did not say it explained what had happened. It did not answer the questions she carried. But it gave her something she desperately needed that morning: a small moment of comfort when almost nothing else could reach her. Sometimes that is what a meaningful encounter does. It does not solve the mystery. It simply gives the grieving heart enough strength to keep standing. And now we come to the fourth creature. This one may surprise you more than the deer, the lamb. Or, unlike the bird, the deer, or the butterfly, the lamb is not necessarily something people encounter in ordinary life during a difficult moment. Instead, stories about the lamb often appear in dreams, visions, moments of prayer, or those unusual states between waking and sleeping that can occur during deep grief or serious illness. People have described seeing a small white lamb, Sometimes it is walking ahead of them on a path. Sometimes it is lying quietly beside them. Sometimes it simply stands nearby, peaceful and completely unafraid. The details vary. One element appears again and again: peace. The lamb holds an especially powerful place within Christian faith because its meaning goes far beyond gentleness. The lamb is connected to sacrifice, innocence, and Christ himself. The image points toward the lamb who was slain and is worthy, and toward the lamb associated with taking away the sin of the world. So when someone in a moment of extreme vulnerability experiences the image of a lamb, the symbol can carry an enormous depth of meaning. Imagine a person facing a frightening diagnosis. Imagine someone lying awake in a hospital room at 4 a.m. Imagine someone exhausted by grief, fear, or uncertainty, and suddenly entering a dreamlike moment in which a calm white lamb appears. For a Christian, that image can become a reminder of sacrifice and love, a reminder that Christ understands suffering, a reminder that he knows what it means to lay something down. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that a person does not have to walk through that difficult moment alone. But there is something we must understand before going any further. These stories should never turn into a search for supernatural experiences. There is a significant difference between receiving comfort and trying to force an encounter. That distinction becomes especially important when people begin looking for practices that promise to summon spirits, communicate with departed loved ones, or deliberately call upon supernatural forces. Or those practices may appear attractive to someone who is grieving. A person who desperately misses someone may want another conversation. Someone who feels abandoned may want a sign on demand. Someone who is frightened may want certainty about what lies beyond what they can see. But Christian faith does not teach us to control the unseen world. It teaches us to trust God. And that means we do not perform rituals to force a sign to appear. We do not demand that heaven prove itself to us. We do not chase mysterious encounters as though they were a substitute for prayer. Instead, we remain humble, we remain prayerful, and if God chooses to use something in creation to remind us of his presence, we can receive that moment with gratitude without turning it into an obsession. Because the moment we begin hunting for signs, something changes. We can become anxious. We start watching every bird, every feather, every animal, waiting for it to tell us what will happen next. And that is not peace. That is anxiety wearing the appearance of faith. The purpose of these stories is not to make you spend every day looking out the window for a particular creature. Purpose is to help you notice the small things without becoming controlled by them, because the Christian message is much bigger than any bird, deer, butterfly, or lamb. The sign is never supposed to become more important than the one who created it. And that is where the real comfort begins. Part 3. The real comfort, then, is not found in constantly searching for signs. It is found in understanding that God does not need us to decode every moment of creation before he can be near us. If a bird, a deer, a butterfly, or even a meaningful image of a lamb brings peace during a difficult season, receive that comfort with humility, but never allow the creature itself to become the center of your faith. That is an important distinction, because there is a temptation, especially when we are hurting, to look for certainty everywhere. When someone we love dies, when a diagnosis changes everything, or when the future becomes frightening, our hearts naturally want something we can hold on to. We want an answer, a signal, a visible confirmation that tells us everything will somehow be okay. But faith does not mean having every mystery explained. Sometimes faith means trusting when the explanation has not arrived. That is why I want to return to the woman on the back steps. She did not receive a detailed explanation about where the bird came from or why it stayed beside her. She did not suddenly understand every question surrounding her husband's death. What changed was something much simpler. For a few minutes, she no longer felt completely alone. And sometimes that is all a hurting heart needs in a particular moment. Or we can become so focused on trying to understand whether an encounter was supernatural that we miss the comfort it produced. The woman did not need to prove that the bird was an angel. She simply experienced a moment in which her grief became a little lighter. That distinction protects us from two opposite mistakes. The first mistake is dismissing every meaningful experience as foolishness. The second is treating every unusual event as undeniable evidence of something supernatural. Both extremes can take us away from the quiet center of faith. There is room for humility. There is room to say, I don't know exactly what happened, but that moment mattered to me. There is also room to say, perhaps this was simply part of creation, and yet God used it to comfort me. We do not have to force certainty where certainty does not exist. That becomes especially important when we think about the stories surrounding the four creatures we have discussed. A bird can be a bird. A deer can simply be a deer. A butterfly can simply be following the natural patterns of its life. A dream can arise from grief, memory, illness, or countless other causes. The original experiences themselves do not always tell us exactly what caused them. What they can tell us is how deeply those moments affected the people who experienced them. For someone grieving a husband, a bird can become associated with the first moment of peace after months of silence. For someone waiting through a loved one's surgery, a deer can become connected with the moment fear finally became quiet. For a grieving mother, a butterfly can become a lasting image of hope and resurrection. And for someone whose heart is struggling with sacrifice, suffering, or uncertainty, the image of a lamb can carry the deepest Christian meaning of all. The important thing is not to turn these experiences into formulas. There is no formula that says a particular bird means one specific event will happen tomorrow. There is no rule that says a deer appearing at the edge of your property guarantees a certain outcome. There is no promise that finding a feather means a departed loved one is directly communicating with you. Those claims go beyond what these stories can establish. Instead, these encounters can be approached as moments that invite reflection. Maybe the bird reminds you of the Father's care for even the smallest creatures. Maybe the deer reminds you of the soul's thirst for God and the need to become still. Maybe the butterfly reminds you that Christian hope is built around transformation and resurrection. Maybe the lamb reminds you of Christ's sacrifice and the love represented by that ancient image. The meaning is not something we have to force onto the world. It can simply become an invitation to turn our attention back toward God. And perhaps that is why the smallest creatures can sometimes affect us so deeply. We spend so much of our lives surrounded by noise. Phones, conversations, responsibilities, schedules, worries, unfinished tasks, and thoughts that refuse to slow down. We can move through an entire day without ever truly noticing what is happening around us. Then something small interrupts the noise. A bird lands near the window, a deer stops at the edge of the trees, a butterfly crosses the path. And for a few seconds, we stop. That pause can matter, not because the creature has magical power, but because the moment gives us an opportunity to become aware again, to breathe, to pray, to remember, to recognize that the world is larger than the problem occupying our minds. And sometimes the most powerful part of an encounter is not what happens outside us, but what happens inside us when we finally become still enough to notice it. That is why I do not want you to become someone who hunts for signs. Do not wake up every morning wondering which creature you must find. Do not become anxious because a particular animal has not appeared. Do not assume that God has forgotten you because the window remains empty, and never believe that you need to perform some special practice before heaven will hear your prayer. Hey, you do not have to summon God's attention. You already have it. The same biblical message that speaks about sparrows points toward this truth. If God knows what happens to creatures that people barely notice, then your life is not invisible to him. Your grief is not invisible. Your fear is not invisible. Your loneliness is not invisible. Even the things you cannot explain to another person are not hidden from him. That is why the next step is not to search harder. It is to pray more honestly tonight before you sleep. You do not need special words. You do not need a complicated ritual. You do not need to prepare anything or create some extraordinary spiritual atmosphere. Simply become quiet for a few moments. Then tell God what is actually happening inside you. If you are lonely, tell him. If you are afraid, tell him. If you are angry, tell him that too. And there are faithful people who have experienced anger toward God during painful seasons, and honesty does not make prayer meaningless. You do not have to pretend that your heart is peaceful when it is not. God is not fragile. He can hear the truth. Sometimes an honest prayer is far more meaningful than words that sound religious, but do not reflect what you actually feel. So tell him what hurts. Tell him what you cannot understand. Tell him what you are carrying. And then, without demanding a sign, simply ask for the strength to remember that you are not alone. That request is very different from trying to command the unseen world. You are not telling God what he must do. You are placing your heart before him and trusting him with whatever comes next. And after you pray, simply remain attentive, not obsessive, not frightened, not constantly checking the window. Just attentive. There is a difference between awareness and obsession. Awareness allows you to notice a moment of beauty. Obsession demands that the moment prove something. Awareness can make you grateful. Obsession can make you anxious. And what we are looking for is peace. So if tomorrow you see a bird outside your window, you do not need to decide immediately that heaven has sent you a message. You can simply pause, breathe, and remember the truth that the bird itself can remind you of. The God who knows even the smallest sparrow has not forgotten you. If a deer appears at the edge of your yard and stands unusually still, you can let the moment remind you to slow down. You can remember the ancient image of a thirsty deer seeking water and ask yourself whether your own soul has been longing for God. If a butterfly appears during a season of grief, you can allow its transformation to bring your mind back to the Christian hope of resurrection. You do not have to prove that the butterfly was sent specifically for you to allow the moment to encourage you. And if the image of a lamb appears during prayer or in a dream, remember what that symbol means within the Christian story. Think about innocence, sacrifice, Christ, and the love that remains present, even when life becomes painful. These moments do not need to become supernatural puzzles. They can simply become reminders. And perhaps that is the healthiest way to receive them. Because the greatest danger is not that we will fail to notice a bird. The greater danger is that we will become so obsessed with signs that we forget them. One those signs are supposed to point toward. Creature is not the destination, the Creator is. And once we understand that, we can look at these stories differently. We can appreciate the tenderness people have found in them without turning them into a system of predictions. We can respect the comfort they have provided without pretending that every unusual encounter has been scientifically or spiritually proven. Most importantly, or if we can allow these stories to lead us back to something much more important than curiosity. Trust, because there will be nights when no bird appears. There will be mornings when the yard is empty. There will be days when no butterfly crosses your path and no unusual moment interrupts your grief. That does not mean God has moved farther away, or thee. His presence does not depend on whether you receive a visible sign, and that may be the most important lesson of all. You are not forgotten simply because nothing unusual happens. You are not abandoned because the silence continues, and you do not have to chase an extraordinary experience to be close to God. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply remaining where you are, telling Him the truth and trusting that He is present even when you cannot see evidence of it in the way you hoped, because the God who sees the sparrow also sees you. And if you remember nothing else from these stories, remember that at day part 4, there is another truth we need to hold on to when we talk about moments like these. Absence of a sign is not the absence of God. Sometimes we can become so focused on what we hope to see that we accidentally make the visible thing more important than the relationship we already have with the Creator. But His nearness does not begin when a bird appears at the window, and it does not disappear when the window remains empty. That matters because grief can make us search for something, anything, that will reassure us. When someone we love is gone, the heart naturally wants one more connection, one more reminder, one more reason to believe that the person we lost has not simply vanished into nothingness. A small encounter can become precious in that situation, but we should receive it as comfort rather than turning it into a promise about things we cannot know. Think again about the woman who sat on her back steps with her tea. Her husband's death had left a silence she could barely endure. And when the little brown bird came close, she experienced something that mattered deeply to her. Power of that moment was not that she suddenly received every answer about death, heaven, or what would happen next. She simply felt less alone. Sometimes that is enough. We often imagine that comfort must solve the problem that caused our pain. But real comfort does not always work that way. A grieving person may still be grieving after a beautiful moment. A frightened person may still be frightened after prayer. Someone waiting for a medical procedure may still have the same uncertainty when the sun rises the next morning. Yet something inside them can become stronger. That is why these encounters should never be treated as guarantees. They do not promise that every illness will disappear, that every surgery will succeed, or that every difficult situation will suddenly turn out the way we want. The stories are about moments of comfort, not contracts with the future. And this is where the distinction between faith and superstition becomes especially important. Superstition tells us that if we discover the right sign, we can know what will happen. Faith tells us that even when we do not know what will happen, we can still trust God. Superstition makes us chase symbols. Faith brings us back to the one we are trusting. Difference can change everything. Imagine someone who sees a white feather and immediately begins searching online for its hidden meaning. Then they see another bird the following morning and start wondering whether it predicts something. Soon, every animal, every sound, and every coincidence becomes part of a puzzle they feel compelled to solve. Instead of bringing peace, the search begins producing anxiety. That is not what these stories are meant to create. If a moment brings you peace, receive the peace. If something beautiful makes you stop and pray, let it lead you toward prayer. But do not make yourself responsible for decoding every ordinary event that happens around you. God does not require you to become an expert in signs before he can hear you. You can speak to him directly. You can sit quietly with him. You can tell him exactly what you are feeling, and sometimes that honest conversation may be more meaningful than anything you see outside your window. Think about what happens when a person finally stops trying to appear strong. They may have spent months telling everyone else that they are fine. They may have smiled through conversations, answered questions, attended gatherings, and continued with daily responsibilities while carrying an enormous amount of pain inside. Then, late at night, when everyone else is asleep, truth finally comes out. I am tired. I am scared. I miss them. I don't understand why this happened. Those words do not make a person weak. They make the prayer honest. And there is something deeply important about bringing that honesty before God instead of trying to hide it behind religious language. You do not have to pretend that everything is fine simply because you believe. Faith does not require you to deny pain. It gives you somewhere to take it. That is why the small creatures in these stories can become meaningful. They can interrupt a moment of overwhelming thought and create just enough space for a person to breathe again. A bird lands, or a deer tops. A butterfly drifts across the path. For a few seconds, the person is no longer trapped completely inside their own thoughts. They look outward. They notice creation. And perhaps in that moment, they remember that their suffering is not the only reality surrounding them. There is still life. There is still beauty. There is still a world beyond the pain. And for someone grieving, that realization can be surprisingly powerful. This is also why the image of the butterfly deserves special attention. The butterfly does not erase the reality of death. Instead, and its transformation can remind believers of the hope that death does not have the final word. That hope has been central to Christian faith for generations. Butterfly begins in a form that seems limited and earthbound. Then it enters a hidden period of transformation before emerging with wings. The comparison is not a scientific explanation of resurrection, and it should not be treated as one. It is a symbol, a picture that helps the human mind imagine transformation. Symbols can be powerful without being magical. That distinction allows us to appreciate them without misunderstanding them. The same is true of the lamb. The lamb is powerful within Christianity because its meaning has been shaped by the biblical story of sacrifice and Christ. When someone sees a lamb in a dream during a frightening period, they may naturally connect that image with innocence, sacrifice, and the Savior. But again, the image does not need to become a prediction. It can simply become a reminder of what the person already believes. And that brings us back to the central message. The signs are never supposed to replace faith. They are never supposed to replace scripture, prayer, or trust, and they certainly should never become objects of worship. The moment a person begins treating a creature as though it possesses supernatural power of its own, the focus has shifted completely. A bird is not God. A butterfly is not God. A deer is not God. A lamb is not God. Creation can point toward the Creator, but creation itself is not the Creator. That may sound obvious, but when someone is hurting, emotions can become incredibly powerful. Grief can make an ordinary moment feel enormous, and that is why humility is so important. You can say, that moment comforted me. You can say, I felt close to God when that happened. You can say, I will always remember that bird. But you do not have to say, this proves exactly what happened in the unseen world. There is a difference, and leaving room for mystery is not a failure of faith. Sometimes it is an expression of faith. We do not know everything. We cannot see everything, and we do not need to. There are things that belong to God alone. Our role is not to control them. Our role is to trust Him. That is also why we should be cautious about teachings that encourage people to deliberately summon spiritual beings or communicate with the dead through rituals, cards, or other practices designed to open contact with whatever might answer. The original message is very clear about this boundary. It does not provide instructions for those practices because the warning is more important than the curiosity. The Christian approach is not to command the unseen world. It is to pray. It is not to demand a message. It is to trust. It is not to chase supernatural experiences. It is to remain grounded in faith. If God chooses to bring comfort through something small and unexpected, receive it gratefully. But never believe that you have to force another encounter because the first one mattered so much. You do not need another bird to prove that the first moment was meaningful. You do not need another butterfly to prove that God heard your prayer. You do not need another feather to prove that you are loved. You already are. And perhaps that is the most comforting realization of all. The Father does not become closer because you found a sign. He was already there. He does not become more attentive because a deer appeared. He already knew what was happening inside your heart. He does not begin listening because you finally asked for a sign. He was listening before you spoke. Sometimes we spend so much energy looking for evidence that we overlook the quiet reality already surrounding us. The person who is grieving may not need another unusual encounter. They may need sleep. Or they may need someone trustworthy to sit beside them. They may need permission to cry. They may need to pray without pretending. The person who is frightened may not need a prediction. They may need courage for the next step. And the person who feels forgotten may not need something extraordinary. They simply need to remember that being unseen by other people does not mean being unseen by God. That is why I want you to approach these stories gently. Do not mock the people who found comfort in them, but do not turn their experiences into universal rules either. Their stories belong to their lives. Your experience may look completely different. Maybe you will never see a bird behave strangely. Maybe no butterfly will ever land near you during a difficult moment. Maybe you will never dream about a lamb. That does not make your faith smaller. And it does not mean God is farther away. Your relationship with God cannot be measured by how many unusual encounters you have. It is measured by trust. It is lived through prayer. It is strengthened through perseverance. And sometimes it survives simply because, even after everything has happened, you choose to keep turning toward Him. So if you have experienced something unusual, you can hold it gently. You do not have to explain it to everyone. You do not have to defend it. You do not have to build your entire faith around it. You can simply remember how you felt in that moment and allow it to lead you toward gratitude. And if nothing unusual ever happens again, you can still be at peace. Because the deepest message was never about the animal. It was about the God who sees you. The bird is small, the deer is quiet, the butterfly is fragile, the lamb is gentle. Yet each image can remind us of something much larger, that the Creator can use even the smallest things to draw our attention back toward hope, prayer, stillness, sacrifice, and trust. And perhaps once we understand that, we stop waiting anxiously for the next sign. Instead, we begin noticing the life already happening around us. We become more present. We become more grateful. We become more willing to sit quietly, and in that quiet, we may discover something far more important than a mysterious encounter. We may discover that we were never alone in the first place. Part 5. So if you are listening to this tonight, while carrying something you have not told anyone about, I want you to pause for a moment and remember what all of these stories are really pointing toward. They are not asking you to become obsessed with birds, deer, butterflies, lambs, feathers, or unusual encounters. They are reminding you that even in the quietest and most painful seasons of life, you can turn your attention back toward a God who has never stopped seeing you. You may be carrying grief from someone you lost. You may be frightened about something that has not happened yet. 1. You may simply be living in a house that has become too quiet, feeling the weight of loneliness in ways you cannot easily explain. Whatever it is, you do not have to pretend that it does not hurt. Tonight, before you go to sleep, try something simple. Sit somewhere quiet for a few minutes. You do not need special words, a special place, or anything complicated. You do not need to perform a ritual or prepare yourself for some extraordinary experience. Simply become still and tell God what is actually happening inside your heart. If you are lonely, tell him you are lonely. If you are afraid, tell him you are afraid. If you are angry, tell him that too. There are faithful people who have experienced anger, confusion, disappointment, and exhaustion. And none of those feelings need to be hidden from God. He can handle the truth of your heart. You do not have to cover your pain with words that sound religious if those words are not honest. Tell him what you miss. Tell him what you cannot understand. Tell him what you are afraid might happen. Tell him what you wish could change. Then, when you have said what you needed to say, simply ask him to help you remember that you are not alone. Notice the difference between that prayer and a demand for a sign. You are not telling God what he must send. You are not asking him to prove himself. You are not trying to control what happens in the unseen world. You are simply opening your heart and trusting him with whatever comes next. And after that, let yourself rest. If something unusual happens tomorrow, you can notice it without becoming obsessed with it. Maybe a small bird appears near your window. Maybe a deer stands quietly at the edge of your yard. Maybe a butterfly lingers near you for a few moments. Maybe nothing happens at all. All 4 possibilities are okay. If a bird appears, you can simply pause and remember the biblical image of the sparrow and the Father's care. If a deer stands nearby, allow the moment to remind you of stillness and the deep longing of the soul for God. Butterfly crosses your path. Remember transformation and the Christian hope that death does not have the final word. And if you encounter the image of a lamb in a dream or during prayer, remember its place within the Christian story, the image of innocence, sacrifice, and Christ. But do not force the moment to become something it cannot prove. You do not need to decide exactly why the creature appeared. You do not need to search for a hidden prediction. You do not need to tell yourself that something terrible or wonderful is about to happen because of what you saw. Simply allow the moment to bring you back to gratitude. That is enough. And if nothing unusual happens, do not become discouraged. God has not disappeared. He has not stopped listening. You have not been forgotten. The absence of a sign is not proof of absence. Sometimes the greatest comfort comes through things that are far less dramatic than we expected. It may come through a conversation with someone who cares about you. It may come through a quiet morning. It may come through prayer when you finally stop trying to hold everything together. It may come through a moment of unexpected peace in the middle of an ordinary day. And sometimes it may come through something as small as a bird landing on a windowsill. That is why I keep thinking about the woman on the back step. She had spent 6 months living inside the silence left by her husband's death. She had reached the point where she was not even sure whether anyone could understand what she was feeling. Then a small brown bird arrived and stayed close to her. She did not receive an explanation. She did not receive a prediction. She did not suddenly stop grieving. But for 20 minutes, she had company. After that moment, something inside her changed. She told me she did not know whether the bird was an angel, but she knew that she no longer felt alone. Maybe that is the heart of the entire story. Not certainty, presence, not control, trust, not a supernatural formula. A reminder, because heaven does not always arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes the most meaningful moments are so ordinary that we almost miss them. A creature moves through the world according to its nature, and somehow, in the middle of our own complicated lives, we happen to notice it. And that moment can make us stop. It can make us breathe. It can make us remember. Maybe we were so consumed by our pain that we had forgotten to look up. Maybe we were so focused on what had been lost that we had stopped noticing what remained. Maybe we were so afraid of tomorrow that we had forgotten that we were still living today. A small creature can interrupt that pattern. Not because it possesses magical power, but because it gives our attention somewhere else to rest for a moment. And sometimes that is enough to create space for hope. Hope does not always arrive loudly. It may begin as a tiny change inside the heart. A little less fear, a little more peace. One breath that feels easier than the last. One moment in which the silence no longer feels quite as empty. One thought that says, maybe I am not carrying this alone. That is why these stories have remained meaningful to so many people. They connect ordinary creation with the deepest questions human beings have always carried. What happens after loss? Where is God when we suffer? Can hope survive grief? Does love continue beyond what we can see? And what do we do when we have no answers? Christian faith does not promise that every question will receive an immediate explanation. It does not tell us that every painful situation will resolve according to our wishes. But it does offer a hope that reaches beyond what we can see. That is why the butterfly can become such a powerful image. That is why the lamb carries such weight. That is why the deer can represent longing, and that is why the sparrow can remind us that even the smallest life is known by the Father. These images do not replace the faith. They can simply point us back toward it. So if you have ever experienced an animal encounter that you could never quite explain, you do not have to be embarrassed about remembering it. You also do not have to build a doctrine around it. You can hold it gently. You can say, I do not know exactly what that was, but it brought me comfort. You can thank God for the peace you felt. And then you can continue walking forward, because the goal is not to spend the rest of your life waiting for another sign. The goal is to become aware of God's presence even when there is no sign at all. That is a much deeper kind of peace. It means you can sit in an empty room and still pray. You can walk through a difficult morning and still trust. You can face uncertainty without needing to know exactly what tomorrow holds. You can grieve someone deeply without believing that your grief means you have been abandoned. You can remember that the God who notices the smallest creatures is not going to overlook you. So, dear one, if life feels especially heavy right now, go gently tonight. Do not demand answers from yourself that you are not ready to have. Do not force yourself to stop grieving. Do not feel guilty because you are tired. And do not believe that your silence means God is absent. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to cry. You are allowed to pray simple prayers. You are allowed to say, Father, I need you. And then you can leave the rest in His hands. Maybe tomorrow there will be a bird outside your window. Maybe a deer will appear at the edge of the trees. Maybe a butterfly will cross your path. Maybe you will dream of a lamb, or maybe tomorrow will look completely ordinary. Whatever happens, remember this. You are not forgotten. Not on the days when you feel strong. Not on the days when you feel completely exhausted. Not in the crowded moments when everyone seems to need something from you. And not in the quiet nights when the house feels painfully empty. You have never been forgotten. The little brown bird did not erase that woman's grief. It simply gave her a moment in which she could breathe inside it. And perhaps that is what you need too. Not an explanation for everything, but enough peace to take the next step. So keep your eyes open, but not anxiously. Pay attention, but do not obsess. Mourn. Receive moments of beauty when they come. And when something small and living crosses your path and causes your heart to become still for just a moment, you do not have to be afraid of that feeling. You can simply say, "Thank you." Then keep walking, because the deepest message was never that a particular creature carries the answer to your future. The deepest message is that the Creator is near, and He does not need to shout to remind you. Sometimes the reminder is quiet. Sometimes it has wings. Sometimes it stands at the edge of the trees. Sometimes it moves gently through the air. And sometimes the reminder is simply the stillness that suddenly settles inside your own chest. Whatever form comfort takes, receive it with gratitude. And when you cannot see it, trust anyway. Because the God who knows every sparrow has not forgotten you. He has not forgotten your grief. He has not forgotten your prayers. He has not forgotten the nights when you thought nobody understood. He has not forgotten the hopes you were afraid to speak aloud, and He has certainly not forgotten you. So go gently tonight. Rest when you can. Pray honestly. Stay close to what is true. And if something small and living catches your attention over the next few days, let yourself stop for a moment. Look, breathe. Remember, you do not have to explain everything. You only have to keep walking in trust. And if this message reached something inside you today, I am grateful that you stayed until the end. Come back again when you need a quiet place to think, pray, and remember that you are not walking through this life alone. Until then, go in peace. And remember that you are watched over far more closely than you may ever realize.